More than 2,000 years ago, a Roman merchant ship disappeared beneath the Mediterranean. No one came back for it. No one recorded where it sank. And for centuries, the sea kept its cargo, its wooden remains, and the secrets of the people who sailed aboard it. Then, beneath the waters off Sicily, something began to emerge from the darkness. Amphora after amphora, the remains of a ship that had been resting there for more than 2,000 years. But imagine for a moment that you were the archaeologist who found it. You could recover only one thing. Would you choose the cargo to discover what the Romans were trading? The ship itself, to discover how they crossed the Mediterranean? Or the personal belongings of the people who sailed into that final night? Choose one in the comments before we begin, because tonight we're going to uncover what this lost Roman ship can still tell us. And perhaps the most fascinating question is not simply why it sank, but what happened to everything aboard it during the 2,000 years that followed. Before we go any deeper, if you enjoy having a night companion beside you on these journeys through history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Mysterious Sleepy History. It helps us grow our little community of night companions and bring more forgotten stories like this one to life. Now, let the world outside disappear for a while. Close your eyes, settle in, and imagine yourself standing on the shores of Sicily more than 2,000 years ago. The Mediterranean stretches into the darkness. And somewhere beneath those quiet waters, a lost Roman ship is waiting to be found. This is the story of the lost Roman ship, a voyage that began more than 2,000 years ago, disappeared beneath the Mediterranean, and remained hidden until the modern world finally came looking. And our journey begins not with the sinking, but with the moment the darkness beneath the sea first revealed that something ancient was waiting there. Far from the crowded streets of modern Sicily, where fishing boats move quietly across the western Mediterranean, the sea floor keeps a different kind of history. Just a few miles from the coast of Mazzara del Vallo, beneath the surface of the water, there is a place where almost everything becomes silent. The light disappears quickly as you descend. The blue of the Mediterranean gradually fades into darker shades, until the world above seems impossibly distant. At around 46 meters below the surface, there is no sunlight strong enough to illuminate the seabed clearly. Visibility can be limited, and shapes emerge only slowly from the darkness. It was here, in this quiet underwater landscape, that something extraordinary had been waiting. The discovery began not with an archaeological expedition, but with information from local fishermen. The waters around western Sicily have been traveled for thousands of years. Long before modern fishing boats crossed them, ancient sailors used these same waters to move between ports, islands, and distant shores. Sicily stood directly within some of the most important maritime routes of the ancient Mediterranean, and its surrounding seabed has preserved traces of that traffic in places where no historian could ever have expected to find them. But this particular wreck had remained hidden. For more than 2,000 years, the sea had covered it. The first important clue came from fishermen who reported something unusual beneath the water. Information like this can be the beginning of an archaeological discovery, but it can also lead nowhere. The Mediterranean floor is full of rocks, geological formations, discarded objects, and the remains of much more recent activity. From the surface, there was no obvious reason to imagine that an ancient ship was resting below. Still, the report was investigated. Among those who descended to examine the area were the Italian divers Giacomo da Mola and Igor Sully, experienced men of the sea who were accustomed to reading the underwater landscape. They were not descending into a perfectly illuminated archaeological site. They were entering a dark and uncertain environment where distance, depth, and poor visibility could make even familiar objects difficult to recognize. At first, what they saw did not look like a ship. It looked like a rock. A large, dark mass rested on the seabed, partly concealed by the surrounding darkness. There was nothing immediately obvious about its shape to announce that human beings had once built it, loaded it, and sent it across the Mediterranean. Damola moved closer. The visibility was not ideal. At that depth, every movement of the water could disturb the view, and the faint available light did little to reveal what lay below. The first impression remained that of an ordinary underwater formation. Then the shape began to change, not because the object itself moved, but because the diver's position changed. Something appeared beneath the dark mass, then another shape, and another. The objects were not stones. They were amphorae, ancient ceramic vessels, standing and lying together across the seabed. For a diver expecting to see a rock, the transformation must have been startling. What had appeared to be an anonymous geological shape was suddenly revealing traces of a human cargo arranged in the darkness below. And there were not merely a few scattered jars. There was an immense concentration of them. The first sight of that cargo changed the meaning of everything around it. A rock could have been ancient, but it could not explain hundreds of carefully made vessels. Amphorae were containers designed for transport, and their presence in such numbers suggested that the dark mass was not simply an underwater formation. It was the remains of a vessel. A ship that had once floated beneath the Mediterranean sun was now resting on the bottom, its cargo still marking the place where its final journey ended. The discovery was remarkable not only because of the number of objects, but because of what the amphorae could tell archaeologists. Many of the vessels have been identified as Dressel 1A amphorae, a type strongly associated with the transport of wine during the late 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Their forms, production traditions, and distribution can help researchers reconstruct ancient commercial networks. To the people who originally handled them, however, these were not archaeological clues. They were containers. They had a practical purpose. Somewhere on land, people had filled them, sealed them, carried them to a ship, and arranged them for a voyage. Someone had expected those vessels to reach another destination. That journey never ended. Instead, the ship disappeared beneath the sea. And because the wreck remained undisturbed for so long, the seabed became something like a sealed room. The wooden parts of an ancient ship are usually among the most vulnerable remains. Wood can decay, be eaten by marine organisms, or disappear through centuries of environmental change. What survives depends greatly on the conditions of the seabed. The amphorae are different. Ceramic vessels can endure. They can break, become covered by sediment, and remain in place for centuries. In this case, their concentration provides a remarkable outline of what happened below the water. Around them are other traces of the ship, including lead components associated with its equipment. The vessel itself is estimated to have been about 21 meters long and 6 meters wide. Those dimensions make the discovery more than a scattered collection of ancient pottery. Beneath the amphorae is the archaeological remains of a real working ship, a vessel that belonged to a Mediterranean world in which sea travel was essential to trade. And yet, at the moment of its discovery, none of that history was visible from the surface. Above the wreck, the Mediterranean continued its ordinary life. Fishing boats passed through the region. Waves moved across the surface. Wind crossed the water. The coastline of Sicily remained where it had always been, but 46 meters below, a different landscape had been preserved. For more than 20 centuries, the wreck had remained in darkness. The people who built the ship had vanished. The sailors who loaded its cargo had vanished. The merchants who waited for the amphory at the other end of the voyage had vanished. Even the world in which the ship had operated had changed beyond recognition. Yet the cargo remained. That is what makes the first moment of the discovery so difficult to imagine. A diver descends into the dark expecting perhaps to confirm the presence of a rock. Instead, beneath him is evidence of a voyage that began more than 2,000 years ago. The amphorae are silent, but they preserve the outline of a story. They tell us that someone needed wine transporting across the sea. Someone organized the cargo. Someone loaded the ship. Someone trusted the vessel to carry its precious contents across the Mediterranean. And then, somewhere along the journey, something went wrong. We do not yet know exactly what happened. That question belongs to the next stage of the investigation. For now, the important fact is simply that the ship was there, hidden beneath the water, waiting for its story to be noticed again. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the discovery was not what the divers could immediately identify, but what they could not yet see. Because beneath the amphorae, beneath the sediment and the darkness, there may be more of the vessel waiting to be understood. The discovery had begun with a report from fishermen. It had continued with two divers approaching what seemed to be a rock. And then, suddenly, the Mediterranean floor had opened a small window into a lost world. For nearly 20 centuries, no human being had stood above that cargo and looked down upon it. Now, for the first time in an extraordinarily long time, someone was there, and beneath them lay the remains of a ship whose final voyage had disappeared from human memory. So the question was no longer whether something ancient had been resting on the seabed. It was something much larger. What exactly had been resting beneath the sea all this time? To understand what had been found beneath the Mediterranean, it helps to imagine the ship not as the broken remains visible on the seabed today, but as a working vessel moving through the water more than 2,000 years ago. Its surviving remains suggest a ship approximately 21 meters long and around 6 meters wide. That was not a tiny coastal boat, but neither was it one of the enormous vessels that later carried armies and grain across the Roman world. It belonged to a practical middle ground, large enough to carry a substantial cargo, yet still suited to the demands of Mediterranean sailing. When this ship was new, the Western Mediterranean was a very different world. Rome was expanding rapidly, but the Roman Empire did not yet exist. The centuries before the beginning of the Christian era were the final generations of the Roman Republic, a period of military conquest, political competition, growing wealth, and increasingly connected Mediterranean trade. Roman power was spreading across Italy and beyond, while merchants, sailors, farmers, and craftsmen were participating in networks that linked distant communities by sea. The ship discovered near Mazzara del Vallo belonged to this changing world. Its exact ownership is not known, and it would be too simple to imagine every vessel of this period as a distinctly Roman ship in the later imperial sense. The Mediterranean was a shared maritime environment. Shipbuilding traditions developed over centuries, influenced by Greek, Phoenician, Punic, Italian, and other seafaring cultures. This was a world in which ships were built for work. They carried commodities from one coast to another, often following routes that connected agricultural regions with busy ports and growing cities. A merchant vessel could transport wine, oil, grain, ceramics, metals, or other goods, depending on its route and cargo. The wreck at Mazzara del Vallo appears to have been carrying wine in amphorae. That tells us something important about the ship. It was not designed simply to carry a few passengers from one harbor to another. Its purpose was commercial. Space mattered. Stability mattered. The ability to carry a heavy and carefully arranged cargo mattered. Imagine the vessel when it was complete. Its hull would have risen above the water in a long wooden shape, broad enough to provide stability and deep enough to carry cargo below deck. The exact appearance of the upper structure is difficult to reconstruct with certainty because so much of the ship has disappeared, but its basic form can be approached through the surviving archaeological evidence and comparisons with other ancient Mediterranean vessels. There would have been no steel framework, no engine, no propeller turning beneath the stern, no navigation lights glowing at night. The ship was a product of timber, rope, sail, human labor, and centuries of accumulated maritime knowledge. Ancient shipbuilders were capable craftsmen. They did not construct ships according to modern engineering drawings, but that does not mean their methods were primitive. Shipbuilding traditions had developed through generations of practical experience. One of the most important features of ancient Mediterranean construction was the way the wooden hull was assembled. In vessels of this broad tradition, planks could be joined using mortise and tenon construction. A projecting piece of wood, the tenon, fitted into a corresponding cavity in another plank, the mortise. Wooden pegs helped secure the joints. This technique created strong connections between the planks themselves. The hull was therefore not simply a collection of boards loosely attached to a supporting frame. The wooden skin of the vessel played a central structural role. Inside that hull, additional timbers provided reinforcement and helped maintain the shape of the ship. Frames, beams, and other structural elements work together to withstand the forces produced by waves, cargo, and the movement of the vessel. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to imagine an ancient ship as a crude wooden platform with a sail attached. It was nothing like that. A ship capable of crossing open stretches of the Mediterranean had to survive changing winds, waves, currents, and the enormous stresses created by its own cargo. The builders had to choose suitable timber. They had to shape the planks. They had to fit joints accurately. They had to make the hull strong enough to carry its load, while remaining light enough to move efficiently through the water. And once the ship was completed, the sea itself became part of its environment. Salt water entered every gap. Waves struck the hull. Ropes stretched and tightened. Wood expanded and contracted. Every voyage placed demands on the vessel, yet the ship was designed to endure those demands. The amphorae inside it were part of that design as well. Thousands of years later, their presence gives us an unusually vivid sense of the vessel's purpose. Ceramic containers could be stacked, arranged, and secured within the cargo space, allowing merchants to move large quantities of liquid goods across the sea. The ship was therefore a floating warehouse of sorts, but unlike a modern cargo vessel, it depended entirely on the forces of nature. There was no engine room hidden below deck. The main source of propulsion was wind. A mast would have supported sails, allowing the crew to use favorable winds to move across the Mediterranean. Oars could be important on many ancient vessels, particularly for maneuvering or for ships designed with rowing crews, but a commercial sailing vessel of this kind relied heavily on its sails for longer journeys. The crew would have had to understand the wind. They needed to recognize changing weather. They had to read the sea, the coastline, currents, and landmarks. Navigation was based largely on experience and observation. The Mediterranean was not an empty space separating different lands. To ancient sailors, it was a network of routes. Sicily occupied an especially important position within that network. The island lies between the eastern and western Mediterranean, and its surrounding waters were crossed by ships moving between different commercial and political worlds. A vessel carrying wine could therefore be part of a much larger chain of exchange. The people who built the ship may never have imagined that it would become an archaeological discovery thousands of years later. For them, it was simply a working ship. It had a useful life. It required maintenance. It carried cargo. It sailed when conditions allowed. And eventually, something happened that brought that useful life to an end. But unlike the people who sailed on it, the ship did not completely disappear. Instead, it became part of the seabed. And that is where the story becomes especially interesting. Because the sea destroys wooden ships, but under certain conditions, it can also protect them. The Mediterranean is a harsh environment for timber. Wood submerged in seawater can be attacked by marine organisms known as shipworms, which are actually specialized bivalve mollusks. They can burrow into wooden structures and gradually weaken them. Bacteria and other microorganisms can also contribute to the breakdown of organic material. Over centuries, exposed timber can become fragile, fragmented, and eventually disappear. So why did anything survive? Part of the answer lies in the seabed itself. Once a wreck settles on the bottom, sediment can accumulate around it. Sand, mud, and other material carried by currents can gradually cover parts of the hull. Objects that were once exposed to the open water may become buried beneath layers of sediment. That burial can reduce exposure to some of the organisms and environmental processes responsible for decomposition. It can also protect objects from physical disturbance. A ship lying exposed on the seabed may be broken apart by storms, currents, anchors, fishing activity, and repeated movement of the surrounding water. A ship that becomes buried can be isolated from some of those forces. In the case of the Mazara wreck, the seabed became a kind of accidental archive, not a perfect one, not a place where every piece of the ship survived untouched, but a place where enough remained to allow archaeologists to reconstruct parts of a vessel that had otherwise vanished from the world above. The distinction is important. When we look at an ancient shipwreck, we are rarely looking at the ship exactly as it existed. We are looking at what the sea allowed us to inherit. The wooden hull may have collapsed. Individual planks may have disappeared. Some fittings may have been scattered. Cargo may have shifted when the vessel struck the seabed. Sediment may have covered some areas while currents exposed others. What remains is therefore the result of both human construction and thousands of years of underwater change. And yet, Even this incomplete survival can reveal an extraordinary amount. The dimensions of the wreck give us a sense of its scale. The surviving construction elements reveal something about ancient shipbuilding. The cargo tells us about its commercial purpose. Together, these clues allow the lost vessel to emerge from the darkness as something more than an archaeological object. We can begin to see it as a ship that once had movement, weight, and purpose. 21 meters of timber, 6 meters across, a hull built by human hands, a cargo hold filled with ceramic vessels, a mast rising above the deck, sails catching the Mediterranean wind, and a crew depending on all of it to carry them safely toward the next harbor. More than 2,000 years later, almost all of that living world has disappeared. The mast is gone. The sails are gone. The voices of the sailors are gone. Much of the timber has returned to the sea, but the shape of the vessel still survives in fragments, and those fragments allow us to ask a more intimate question. If we could have stood on the deck when the ship was new, what would we have seen? Not a wreck, not an archaeological site, but a busy merchant vessel, loaded for a journey through a Mediterranean world on the edge of enormous change. A ship from another world. The ship may have disappeared beneath the Mediterranean, but its cargo remained remarkably expressive. Among the most important objects on the seabed were the amphorae, hundreds of ceramic vessels that had once been packed inside the merchant ship. To understand why their presence matters so much, it helps to understand what an amphora actually was. An amphora was a large ceramic container designed primarily for transporting goods. Its shape was practical rather than decorative. Most had a narrow neck, a rounded or elongated body, and two handles near the upper part, allowing them to be carried more easily despite their considerable weight. They were the ancient Mediterranean's answer to a problem that every merchant understood. How do you move a valuable liquid over a long distance without simply carrying it in open buckets or fragile household containers? The answer was the amphora. Wine could be poured into one, sealed, and transporting by ship. Olive oil could be carried in another. Fish sauces, fruit products, and other commodities also traveled in amphorae. They were containers, but they were also something more. They were evidence of trade. When hundreds of amphorae are discovered together in a shipwreck, they provide a remarkable picture of the commercial activity that brought the vessel to sea. One amphora tells us relatively little. 500 tell us something much larger. They suggest organization. A cargo of this scale did not appear on the ship by accident. The vessels had to be produced, filled, transporting to the harbor, brought aboard, arranged within the ship, and secured for the voyage. Each amphora therefore represents the final stage of a much longer process. Long before the ship left Sicily, or whichever harbor supplied its cargo, clay had been collected. Potters had prepared it. The material had been shaped by hand or with the help of simple forming techniques. The body of the vessel was created, the neck added, the handles attached, and the surface finished. Then the amphora had to be dried sufficiently before being fired. A pottery kiln transformed the soft clay into the hard ceramic vessel that could survive handling and transport. The process required experience. If the clay contained unsuitable material, if the vessel was badly formed, or if the firing was uneven, the amphora could crack or fail before it ever reached the marketplace. The successful vessels, however, became durable containers. They could be carried to storage areas, filled with their contents, sealed and prepared for transport. and eventually they reached a harbor. There they became part of the ship's cargo. The amphorae from the wreck are particularly important because many have been identified as Dressel 1A amphorae. The Dressel 1 type is one of the best-known Roman Republican wine amphora forms, and the 1A variant is associated broadly with the later 2nd and 1st centuries BC. That chronological association matters. Ancient ships do not always come with a date written on their hull. There is no label saying exactly when the vessel sank. Archaeologists therefore have to build a date from evidence. Pottery is one of the most useful forms of evidence because ceramic styles change over time. A particular amphora shape may become common during one period, decline during another, and eventually disappear. When archaeologists recognize the form, they can compare it with securely dated examples from other sites. In this way, a simple ceramic vessel becomes a kind of chronological clue. The Dressel 1A amphorae found with the wreck help place the ship within the broad world of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, during the final generations of the Roman Republic. But the amphorae tell us more than when the ship probably existed. They also tell us something about what it was carrying: wine. During this period, wine was a major commodity in Mediterranean trade. It was not simply a drink consumed privately by wealthy households. Wine moved between agricultural regions and urban markets. It was produced in different areas, stored in different kinds of containers, and transporting by land and sea. Italian wine, in particular, became increasingly important as Roman power expanded and agricultural production intensified. The ship discovered near Mazzara del Vallo appears to have been part of that commercial system. Imagine the cargo hold before the ship sank. Rows of ceramic vessels filling the available space. The amphorae would have been heavy even before being filled. Once loaded with wine, their combined weight became enormous. That weight had to be distributed carefully. A merchant ship could not simply have its crew throw hundreds of amphorae into the bottom of the hull and hope for the best. The cargo had to be arranged. The safest position for a heavy load was low in the vessel, helping maintain stability. Amphorae could be placed closely together, with their bodies supported by neighboring vessels and other packing material. Their shape was useful here. The rounded bodies could fit together in dense groups, while the narrow necks and handles created points where individual vessels could be handled and secured. The exact arrangement would have depended on the ship, the cargo, and the experience of the crew, and archaeologists must be cautious about assuming a single universal loading method. But the principle was simple. The cargo had to survive the voyage. A ship crossing the Mediterranean was constantly moving. Even in relatively calm conditions, the hull rose and fell with the water. Waves caused the vessel to pitch and roll. Sudden changes in direction could shift unsecured objects. A heavy amphora falling against another could break both. A broken vessel was not merely a loss of cargo. It could also create a dangerous mess inside the ship, spreading liquid through the hold and disturbing the carefully balanced load. So the cargo was part of the ship's stability. Every amphora placed inside the vessel contributed to the overall weight distribution. The sailors and merchants responsible for loading it would have understood this through experience. They did not need modern calculations to know that a ship loaded unevenly would behave badly. They knew the sea. They knew the vessel. They knew how much cargo it could carry. and they knew that hundreds of ceramic containers had to arrive intact. There is something almost industrial about imagining the scale of this process. One amphora was manageable. Hundreds required organization. Potters producing vessels in quantity, workers moving them, farmers and producers supplying wine, merchants arranging purchases, transporters carrying the amphorae toward the harbor, dock workers loading them aboard, sailors securing the cargo, and finally, the ship leaving the coast. The wreck preserves only the last part of this chain, yet the amphorae allow us to work backwards. Their shape tells us about manufacturing traditions. Their fabric can sometimes reveal where the clay originated. Their contents, when traces survive, can provide clues about what they carried. Their arrangement can tell archaeologists about the cargo space, and their presence alongside other ceramic forms can reveal connections between different regions. This is one of the reasons archaeologists pay such close attention to amphora types. Not every amphora was the same. Different shapes were associated with different products, regions, periods, and traditions. Some were designed for wine. Others were commonly used for olive oil. Others transporting fish products or other commodities. Even within the broad category of wine amphorae, forms changed through time and varied by place of production. A Dressel 1A, therefore, belongs to a particular historical context. It is not simply an ancient jar. Its shape carries information. The clay carries information. The traces of its contents carry information. And when many examples occur together, those clues become much stronger. Archaeologists can compare them with amphorae from excavated settlements, warehouses, harbors, and other shipwrecks. Patterns begin to appear. A certain amphora type may be found far from the region where it was produced. That distribution can reveal trade routes. If similar vessels appear in distant ports, they provide evidence that goods were moving between those places. The Mediterranean begins to look less like a collection of isolated communities and more like an interconnected commercial landscape. The shipwreck near Mazara del Vallo sits within that landscape. Its cargo suggests that the vessel was participating in a system that depended on maritime transport. And that system was becoming increasingly important during the period in which the Roman Republic was expanding. The amphorae also remind us that ancient trade was not simply about moving objects. It was about moving their contents. Wine began somewhere as grapes growing in a vineyard. The grapes were harvested. They were processed. The resulting wine was stored. At some point, it was transferred into amphorae. The vessels were sealed. Then they became cargo. The wine that had begun as an agricultural product was transformed into a commercial commodity capable of traveling hundreds of kilometers by land and sea. Every amphora, therefore, contained two histories. One was the history of the container itself. The other was the history of what had been placed inside it. And in the darkness of the wreck, both histories became frozen together. Some amphorae were still recognizable as vessels. Others had broken. Fragments lay among the sediment, but even broken pottery could remain useful to archaeologists. A fragment of a rim can identify a vessel form. A piece of the body can reveal its ceramic fabric. A handle can help distinguish one type from another. The archaeological record does not require an object to remain complete in order to speak. Sometimes the smallest pieces provide the most precise clues. The hundreds of amphorae therefore transform the wreck into something much more than a lost ship. They make it a snapshot of ancient commerce, a snapshot taken at the exact moment when the ship's journey ended. Somewhere on land, these vessels had been ordinary objects of production and trade. On the ship, they became cargo. At sea, they became part of a carefully balanced load. And after the wreck, they became archaeological evidence. For more than 2,000 years, they remained below the surface, surrounded by darkness and sediment. The people who had loaded them had no reason to imagine that one day divers would descend into that darkness and study the vessels individually. They could not have known that their shapes would help establish the age of the wreck. They could not have known that the cargo would reveal the commercial character of the ship. And they certainly could not have imagined that a ceramic container intended to carry wine across the Mediterranean would eventually become one of the most important clues to a lost voyage. Yet that is precisely what happened. 500 amphorae were not merely sitting inside an ancient ship. They were preserving the final record of its purpose. A merchant vessel had gone to sea carrying a valuable cargo. The cargo had been carefully produced, filled, transporting, and loaded. The ship had been prepared for another journey. And then, somewhere beyond the harbor, the journey ended. The wine remained sealed within the history of the vessels that carried it. The ship disappeared. The sailors disappeared. The merchants disappeared. But the amphorae endured. And by enduring, they left behind a remarkably detailed trail, one that could eventually lead archaeologists back toward the world in which the lost ship had once sailed. So the amphorae tell us that the ship was carrying a commercial cargo. But that leads to a more specific question. What was inside those amphorae? The most likely answer for the Dressel 1A vessels associated with this wreck is wine. That single word opens a much larger window onto the ancient Mediterranean, because wine was not simply something poured into a cup at the end of a long day. It was an agricultural product, a commodity, and a valuable part of regional trade. An amphora could begin its life in a pottery workshop and end its journey hundreds of kilometers away, carrying the produce of a vineyard to a completely different community. For the people involved in that trade, the liquid inside the vessel mattered far more than the empty ceramic container that would eventually remain behind. The amphora was the means of transport. The wine was the valuable cargo. Yet wine was only one part of the ancient Mediterranean trade in liquids. Olive oil was equally important. The olive tree was deeply connected to Mediterranean agriculture, and oil had many uses. It was food, but it was also used for lighting, cooking, personal care, and other practical purposes. Large quantities, therefore, had to be transporting from producing regions toward places where demand was greater. Other liquids and semi-liquid products could also travel in amphorae, including fish-based sauces and various processed agricultural products. Different products required different containers and different handling methods. This is why archaeologists are careful not to assume that every ancient amphora carried the same thing. The shape of a vessel can provide an important clue, but it does not automatically reveal its contents. Two amphorae might look similar while having different histories. Conversely, the same broad product could be transporting in different amphora forms depending on the period and region. The container and its contents were connected, but they were not identical. That distinction matters when looking at the wreck. The amphorae were not simply empty jars abandoned on the seabed. They were the final packaging of an economic process. Somewhere before the voyage, wine had been produced, grapes had been harvested, The juice had been fermented and stored. The finished product had then entered a system of distribution. At some point, it was transferred into ceramic containers suitable for transport. The amphorae were closed and prepared for shipment. Then they were loaded onto the merchant vessel. By the time the ship left harbor, each container represented a certain amount of agricultural production, labor, transportation, and money. That gives an amphora an economic significance that is easy to miss when we see one sitting in a museum. Today, an ancient amphora may look like an archaeological object. To an ancient merchant, it was part of an investment. The vessel itself had a cost. The product inside had a much greater value. Someone had paid for the wine. Someone had paid for the pottery. Someone had paid the workers who moved the cargo. Someone had paid for transportation. And someone expected to make a profit when the cargo reached its destination. A shipwreck could therefore destroy an entire chain of economic activity in a single moment. Hundreds of amphorae going to market could suddenly become hundreds of lost investments. For the merchant, it was a disaster. For the archaeologist, centuries later, it became evidence. And that evidence can sometimes reveal where the cargo came from. An amphora does not carry a modern label saying where it was made, but ancient manufacturers sometimes left marks. Stamps, inscriptions, painted marks, symbols, and other traces could be placed on vessels during production, distribution, or use. Not every amphora bears such a mark, and their meanings can vary. Some stamps are associated with workshops or producers. Others may relate to officials, institutions, batches, or systems of control. Painted inscriptions could sometimes record information about the contents, quantities, ownership, or movement of a vessel. These marks are especially valuable because they can connect an otherwise anonymous ceramic object to a particular production tradition. Even when there is no readable inscription, the pottery itself can provide clues. The shape of the amphora is one. The fabric of the clay is another. Clay is not identical everywhere. Different geological regions contain different combinations of minerals and other materials. When potters worked with local clay, the resulting ceramic could preserve a chemical and mineral signature of its place of manufacture. This is one of the ways archaeologists investigate provenance. A vessel can be examined visually, but researchers can also use scientific techniques to study its ceramic fabric. Microscopic examination can reveal mineral inclusions and manufacturing characteristics. More advanced analyses can compare the chemical composition of the clay with samples from known production areas. When those results are combined with archaeological evidence, researchers may be able to determine whether an amphora was produced locally or brought from another region. The process is rarely as simple as finding a perfect match. Ancient workshops could use clay sources that varied over time. Different workshops could operate close to one another. Trade could move vessels far beyond their original production zones, and some amphora types were copied in regions far from where the original form developed. So archaeologists have to combine multiple clues: shape, clay, manufacturing technique, stamps, inscriptions, residues, archaeological context, and comparison with other finds. Together, these details can begin to reveal the history of an amphora. There is another particularly intriguing source of information: residue. Even after centuries underwater, traces of ancient contents can sometimes survive within the ceramic walls or sediment surrounding the vessel. Organic materials usually degrade, but chemical residues and microscopic traces can sometimes remain. Researchers can analyze these traces to investigate what an amphora once contained. Certain compounds can be associated with particular products. In the case of wine, chemical evidence can sometimes support an interpretation suggested by the vessel type and archaeological context. For olive oil, other chemical signatures may be useful. The process requires caution because contamination can occur over thousands of years, and not every chemical trace has a single unmistakable explanation. Still, the combination of archaeology and science allows researchers to ask questions that would otherwise be impossible. What was inside the vessel? Where was it produced? Where did the clay come from? Was the container made locally or imported? Was it filled once or reused? Who may have owned it? And where was it supposed to go? An amphora, therefore, becomes something like a small archaeological record. Its walls preserve traces of manufacturing. Its shape preserves traditions. Its markings can preserve information about people and institutions. Its residue can preserve clues about its contents, and its location within a shipwreck preserves the final moment of its journey. This is particularly important for a commercial vessel. The ship was not carrying random objects. Its cargo had been assembled for a purpose. The people who loaded it had chosen particular containers for particular goods. The quantities mattered. The destinations mattered. The timing mattered. And the value of the cargo mattered. The Mediterranean economy depended heavily on these kinds of movements. Agricultural production was unevenly distributed. One region might produce abundant wine. Another might produce large quantities of olive oil. A busy urban center might have enormous demand but limited agricultural land nearby. Sea transport offered a solution. A merchant ship could collect products from one region and carry them toward another. The sea, which today can appear to separate communities, was in many ways what connected them. A cargo ship did not need to travel an enormous distance for its voyage to matter. A shipment moving from one coastal region to another could connect farmers, potters, merchants, sailors, port workers, tavern owners, and consumers. Every amphora was part of that chain. And when hundreds were carried together, the ship became a moving concentration of economic activity. This is why the question of what was inside the jars is more important than it first appears. If the vessels contained wine, they point toward vineyards, production centers, merchants, and consumers. If other amphorae carried oil or different products, they could reveal additional trade connections. The cargo becomes a map, not a map drawn with roads and borders, but one drawn through objects. An amphora made in one region can appear in another. A particular ceramic fabric can be found hundreds of kilometers from its source. A stamp can connect a vessel to a producer. A residue can suggest what it carried. And when enough examples are studied, patterns emerge. Archaeologists can compare the wreck with other shipwrecks and settlements. They can ask whether the same amphora types appear in distant markets. They can examine whether the distribution changes over time. They can trace the expansion of particular products and production centers. In this way, a single ship can contribute to a much larger understanding of Mediterranean commerce. And there is something strangely intimate about the process. A merchant thousands of years ago might have handled one of these vessels without giving any thought to the distant future. He would have seen a useful container. He might have known its contents, its price, and its destination. He might have known the person who sold it. He might have known the ship's captain. He might have known exactly how much profit the cargo was expected to bring. But he could not have known that the same ceramic vessel would eventually lie beneath the sea, surrounded by darkness, waiting for archaeologists to study the faint traces left inside it. The amphora had been designed to disappear into the normal rhythm of trade. Fill it, seal it, load it, transport it, empty it, perhaps reuse it, perhaps discard it. Nothing about its original purpose suggested that it would survive for 2,000 years as historical evidence. And yet it did. The shipwreck froze that commercial moment. The jars remained with the vessel. Their arrangement preserved something of the cargo. Their forms preserved the traditions of their makers. Their markings, where present, could preserve traces of ownership and production. Their ceramic fabric could point toward distant landscapes, and whatever microscopic remnants survived within them could offer clues about the liquids that had once filled their hollow interiors. So when we look at those hundreds of amphorae, we should not see only pottery. We should see wine moving through an ancient economy, olive oil moving between producers and consumers, merchants calculating costs and profits, workers carrying heavy vessels toward the harbor, sailors loading them into the hold, and a Mediterranean network in which goods, people, and wealth were constantly moving across the sea. The jars were containers, but they were also records. And in the darkness beneath Sicily, those records had survived long enough for the modern world to begin reading them. The cargo tells us what the ship was carrying, but to understand why that cargo was at sea at all, we have to widen the view, pull back from the wreck beneath the water, look beyond the amphorae, beyond the hull, beyond the coast of Mazara del Vallo. There is a much larger landscape surrounding the ship, the Mediterranean. For the people who lived around its shores, this sea was not simply a vast body of water separating one country from another. Long before modern borders existed, the Mediterranean connected communities through movement, trade, migration, warfare, and communication. Its coastlines formed a network of ports. Its islands became stepping stones. Its winds and currents shaped the routes of sailors, and ships carried goods from one shore to another. By the final centuries of the Roman Republic, the Mediterranean was becoming increasingly integrated into the expanding Roman world. Rome itself had begun as a city in central Italy, but its influence had spread far beyond the Italian peninsula. Through conquest, alliances, and commerce, Roman power reached across regions that had previously belonged to different political and cultural spheres. The sea became essential to maintaining those connections. Italy needed supplies. Cities needed food. Armies needed equipment. Merchants wanted access to profitable markets. Producers wanted to reach customers far beyond their own communities, and ships provided a way to move large quantities of goods more efficiently than land transport over many distances. The geography of Sicily made the island particularly important. Sicily lies near the center of the Mediterranean, positioned between the eastern and western basins and close to the southern Italian mainland. From its shores, routes could lead toward the Italian peninsula, North Africa, Sardinia, Corsica, and the western Mediterranean. To the east lay the Greek world and the sea routes leading toward the central and eastern Mediterranean. To the west lay the waters leading toward the islands and coastlines of the western Mediterranean. Sicily was therefore not an isolated island at the edge of the ancient world. It was a crossroads, and a ship sailing around its shores was moving through one of the most important maritime environments of antiquity. The coastline itself provided opportunities for anchorage and harbor facilities. Some ports grew around natural bays. Others developed into organized commercial centers where ships could load and unload cargo, obtain supplies, repair equipment, and exchange information. The ancient port was much more than a place where a ship stopped. It was a meeting point. Merchants could negotiate prices. Sailors could find work. Cargo could be inspected and transferred. Local producers could bring their goods toward the waterfront. Warehouses could hold commodities before their next journey. And news could travel with the ships. A merchant arriving from another coast might bring information about prices, weather, political events, or the safety of particular routes. The Mediterranean was therefore connected not only by cargo, but by people. Consider the sailors themselves. A merchant vessel could not cross open water without a crew capable of handling the ship. Someone had to manage the sails. Someone had to steer. Someone had to watch the weather. Someone had to maintain the vessel. Someone had to organize the cargo. These sailors possessed knowledge that was rarely written down in the way modern navigational manuals are written. They learned from experience. They knew familiar coastlines. They recognized landmarks. They understood seasonal winds. They knew which stretches of coast offered shelter and which were dangerous during particular weather conditions. A voyage was not simply a straight line between 2 points. The route depended on conditions. Wind could make one direction easy and another nearly impossible. A sudden storm could force a captain toward a different harbor. Currents could help or hinder progress. The crew had to make decisions continuously. This makes reconstructing the exact route of the lost ship extremely difficult. The wreck tells us where its journey ended. Its cargo tells us something about the commercial world it belonged to, but the exact path it followed before sinking remains uncertain. Still, geography allows us to consider the possibilities. A ship carrying wine in Dressel, 1A amphorae, may have been connected to the growing wine trade of the Italian peninsula. It could have traveled between production areas and coastal markets. It might have stopped at intermediate ports. It could have followed the Sicilian coast before heading toward another destination. The vessel may have been part of a longer commercial route, or it may have been making a comparatively short journey. We should resist the temptation to draw a perfect line across the map. Ancient sailors did not have modern shipping schedules. Their journeys were flexible. A captain might alter the course because of weather. A merchant might decide to stop at another port. A cargo might be exchanged before the ship reached its final destination. The Mediterranean trade network was therefore not a rigid system. It was constantly changing, yet the major geographic connections were persistent. Italy was connected to Sicily. Sicily was connected to North Africa. The Western Mediterranean was connected to the Greek world through routes that passed through islands and coastal settlements. And the growing Roman sphere increasingly brought these different regions into the same political and economic system. The sea made those connections possible. Imagine the Mediterranean during a busy season. From the shore, the horizon might appear empty, but beneath that apparently endless blue surface, ships were moving. Some were small coastal craft. Others were larger merchant vessels. Some carried wine. Others carried oil, some transporting grain. Others carried pottery, metals, timber, or manufactured goods. There were fishing boats, military vessels, passenger craft, and ships whose precise purposes are now impossible to identify. Every vessel represented movement. Every voyage connected one place to another, and every port represented another point in the network. Sicily's position meant that ships did not have to treat the island merely as a destination. It could also serve as a waypoint. A vessel traveling through the central Mediterranean could use its harbors for shelter, supplies, repairs, or commercial exchange. This made the island strategically and economically valuable. Its geography could not be ignored. The same location that made Sicily attractive to merchants also made it important to states and armies. Control of the island meant access to maritime routes. Control of nearby ports meant influence over movement through the central Mediterranean. By the late Republican period, Rome understood the importance of this position very clearly. But the commercial world was not created by Rome alone. Long before Roman dominance, Greek, Phoenician, and Carthaginian communities had established maritime networks across the Mediterranean. Their sailors had already developed routes, ports, and trading relationships. Rome entered an already ancient maritime world and gradually absorbed, transformed, and expanded many of its connections. That history matters when we look at a wreck from this period. The ship was not sailing through an entirely new Roman sea. It was sailing through a sea whose commercial traditions stretched back many centuries. The people aboard the vessel inherited knowledge from earlier generations. The shape of the ship reflected older shipbuilding traditions. The amphory reflected established systems of production and trade. The route itself may have followed paths used by sailors long before Roman expansion. The Roman world was therefore built upon an older Mediterranean network, and Sicily stood directly within it. The coast near Mazara del Vallo faces westward toward the open Mediterranean. From here, the sea stretches toward other islands and distant shores. A vessel leaving this region could become part of a chain of movement that extended far beyond the immediate horizon. Perhaps its cargo was intended for a nearby market. Perhaps it was destined for another island. Perhaps it was heading toward a port much farther away. We cannot know the exact destination simply from the wreck, but we can understand why the ship was there. It was in a region where maritime movement was normal. The sea was the road. The ship was the vehicle. The amphory were the cargo. The sailors were the people who knew how to make the journey possible, and the merchants were the ones who gave the journey its economic purpose. There was no single ancient Mediterranean highway. There were countless overlapping routes. Some hugged the coastline. Others crossed open water between islands. Some connected major ports directly. Others developed through a series of shorter voyages and exchanges. The result was a network that could carry goods over enormous distances. A wine produced in one agricultural region could eventually be consumed in a city far away. Oil from another region could appear in markets separated from its source by hundreds of kilometers of sea. Ceramics could travel with merchants. Information could travel with sailors. People could move with the ships. The Mediterranean was therefore not simply an obstacle to ancient societies. It was one of the mechanisms that allowed them to become interconnected. And this is why the lost ship near Mazara del Vallo is so valuable. It gives us a single, preserved moment within that much larger system. We can see the cargo. We can study the vessel. We can examine the amphory. But behind all of those objects lies an invisible network of producers, merchants, sailors, ports, and consumers. The ship was one moving piece in that network. Its journey began somewhere. Its cargo came from somewhere. Its crew had a destination. And somewhere along the way, the Mediterranean changed from a highway into a graveyard. The ship stopped moving. The cargo stopped moving. The sailor's route ended. But the network itself continued. Other ships crossed the same waters. Other merchants loaded other amphorae. Other sailors followed familiar coastlines. And Sicily remained where geography had placed it, at the center of the routes. Thousands of years later, the sea still moves around the island. The same winds still cross its waters. The same coastline still faces the Mediterranean. But the ships have changed. The merchants have changed. The languages have changed. The world has changed. Only the geography remains almost impossibly familiar. And beneath that familiar sea, the wreck preserves one quiet fragment of the time when the Mediterranean truly was an ancient highway. The ship was not only timber, pottery, and cargo. It carried people. Although the wreck cannot tell us the names of everyone who stood aboard it, we can reconstruct something of the human world that would have surrounded a merchant voyage during the late Roman Republican period. At the center of the voyage was the captain, or master of the vessel. He was responsible for the ship's course and for decisions that could determine whether the voyage continued safely. He needed to understand winds, currents, coastlines, weather, and the capabilities of his vessel. But he was not sailing alone. There were sailors to handle the rigging, sails, steering equipment, cargo, and routine maintenance. On a commercial ship, every person had practical work to perform. A voyage was a shared responsibility, even if authority was not equally shared. There may also have been merchants or representatives of merchants connected with the cargo. The people who owned or financed the goods did not necessarily perform the work of sailing the ship. Ancient commerce depended on different groups working together: producers, traders, transporters, sailors, and laborers. The social world aboard such a vessel could therefore be mixed. Free sailors worked alongside people of very different backgrounds, and enslaved people were a normal part of the wider economy of the ancient Mediterranean. Enslaved labor was used in agriculture, workshops, households, ports, and many other areas of Roman Republican society. We cannot say with certainty how many enslaved people were aboard this particular ship, or precisely what roles they performed. The wreck provides no reliable list of its crew, but the possibility of enslaved labor should be understood within the broader economic world in which the vessel operated. For everyone aboard, life at sea was intensely practical. There was little privacy. The ship was a working environment, and space was limited. Cargo occupied much of the interior, leaving the crew with only restricted areas for movement, rest, and daily tasks. Food had to be simple and durable. Fresh supplies could be limited on a longer voyage, so sailors depended heavily on provisions that could survive storage. Grains, dried foods, legumes, salted products, and other preserved supplies. Water was especially important and had to be carried aboard in suitable containers. There was no comfortable cabin waiting for each sailor at the end of a working day. Sleep could be taken wherever space allowed, often on or near the deck or in sheltered areas of the vessel. Rest was interrupted by the needs of the voyage. Someone always had to be awake. The ship could not simply stop because the crew was tired. Watch duties allowed sailors to divide the night into periods of responsibility. While some rested, others watched the sea, the weather, the sails, and the course of the vessel. At night, the Mediterranean became a very different place. The coastline could disappear into darkness. Without modern navigation lights, electronic instruments, or accurate charts, sailors depended on experience and observation. They could use the stars when conditions allowed, recognize familiar coastlines and landmarks, and estimate their position from the direction of travel and the environment around them. But the darkness also concealed danger. A storm could arrive before it was fully visible. Rocks and unfamiliar shores could become difficult to identify. A change in wind could alter the ship's course. And when the moon was hidden by clouds, the sea could become almost completely black. For sailors who spent their lives on the water, fear was not necessarily unusual. It was part of understanding the sea. Storms were among the greatest dangers. So were reefs, navigational errors, damaged rigging, and the simple possibility that a vessel might become impossible to control. The ancient Mediterranean also had its own traditions of omens and maritime beliefs. Sailors lived in a world where the boundary between practical knowledge and superstition was not as sharply defined as it is today. Unusual weather, strange animal behavior, dreams, birds, or other signs could be interpreted as warnings. Rituals and offerings to gods connected with the sea could form part of maritime life. For sailors, the voyage was therefore both a practical undertaking and an encounter with forces they could not always control. They knew how to read winds and coastlines. They knew how to handle sails. They knew how to repair equipment. But they also knew that the sea could change without warning. Imagine the ship during one of those night watches. Most of the crew are sleeping. The cargo lies secured below. The sails move in the darkness. A few sailors remain awake, listening to the water against the hull and watching the faint outline of the sea. Above them, the stars stretch across the sky. There are no city lights on the horizon. No engine vibrates beneath their feet. Only wind, timber, rope, and water. For the people aboard the ship, this was not a historical scene. It was simply another night at work. They were trying to reach their destination. They expected the next morning to come. They expected to see land again. They expected the cargo to arrive and the voyage to become another completed journey. But this particular journey would not become one of those ordinary voyages. At some point, the people aboard would lose control of their ship, and whatever they experienced during those final moments has largely disappeared with them. The wreck gives us the cargo. The seabed gives us fragments of the vessel, but the people themselves left almost no direct trace. Their names are unknown. Their voices are gone. Their daily routines can only be reconstructed from what we know about ancient sailing. Yet they are essential to understanding the wreck, because the ship did not sink by itself. People were aboard when its final journey unfolded. People had eaten there, slept there, worked there, watched the night from its deck, and trusted its wooden hull to carry them safely across the Mediterranean. And somewhere in the darkness, that confidence would be tested. A single merchant ship could carry much more than its cargo. Behind every amphora was a network of people, money, labor, and decisions stretching far beyond the deck of the vessel. By the late 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the Roman world was becoming increasingly connected through trade. Rome's expansion brought new territories, new markets, and growing demand for agricultural products. Wine was an important part of this economy, and the movement of wine created opportunities for farmers, pottery workshops, merchants, transporters, and sailors. The process began on land. Producers cultivated vineyards and transformed grapes into wine. Potters produced the amphorae needed to transport it. Workers moved the containers towards storage areas and ports. Merchants purchased or organized the cargo and arranged its transportation. At the harbor, another layer of activity began. Ships needed to be loaded. Goods had to be measured, stored, inspected, and sometimes taxed. Port workers, officials, traders, and sailors all became part of the same commercial process. The Roman state could also benefit from this movement of goods through taxes, customs duties, and other forms of revenue. The exact system varied by place and period, but trade was not completely separate from government. Ports and commercial routes were connected to political power. A merchant, therefore, had to think about much more than the price of wine. He had to consider transportation costs, port charges, taxes, storage, risks at sea, and the possibility that part of the cargo might be lost. And the sea itself offered an enormous advantage. Moving heavy goods by land was expensive and difficult. Roads could be rough. Animals could carry only limited loads, and long-distance transport required many stages. A ship could carry far more weight at once. Hundreds of amphorae could be loaded into a single vessel and moved across the Mediterranean with a relatively small crew. This made maritime trade essential. The shipwreck near Mazzara del Vallo, therefore, represents only one small point within a much larger economic system. The wine inside the amphorae connected agricultural land with distant consumers. The pottery connected workshops with merchants. The harbour connected land transport with sea transport. The sailors connected the cargo with its destination. And the state, through taxation and administration, could take a share of the wealth created by this movement. Even a relatively ordinary merchant voyage could therefore involve dozens or hundreds of people indirectly. A farmer might never meet the merchant who bought the wine. The potter might never see the port where the amphora was unloaded. The sailor might never know who ultimately drank the wine. Yet all of them were connected by the same cargo. This is what makes a shipwreck so valuable to historians. Written sources often tell us about rulers, wars, laws, and political events. A wreck can tell us about something quieter. It can show what people were producing, what they were buying, how goods were packaged, and how those goods moved across the sea. The lost ship is therefore not just evidence of a maritime accident. It is a fragment of economic history. Its amphorae reveal a commercial demand. Its size reveals the scale of transportation. Its location places it within the Mediterranean network, and its cargo shows how agricultural production could become part of a market, extending far beyond the place where the product was made. For the people aboard the ship, this was simply business. They were carrying a valuable cargo toward a destination. But behind that ordinary voyage stood an enormous system of production, trade, taxation, transportation, and consumption. That is the hidden story inside the wreck. A single ship may seem small compared with the vast Roman world, but follow its cargo backward and the network expands. Follow the wine to the vineyard. Follow the amphora to the workshop. Follow the ship to the harbour. Follow the merchant to the market. And suddenly, one sunken vessel becomes a small window into the economic machinery of ancient Rome. More than 2,000 years later, The ship is silent, but its cargo still shows us how the Roman world moved. At some point, the merchant ship left a harbour and entered the Mediterranean for what was expected to be an ordinary commercial voyage. Where exactly it began, however, is not certain. The cargo provides clues, but not a complete itinerary. The Dressel 1A amphorae connect the vessel with the wine trade of the late Roman Republican period, while the wider archaeological evidence can help researchers consider possible regions of production and exchange. But an amphora can tell us where it was made without telling us every place it traveled. A vessel produced in one region could be transporting to another harbor before being loaded onto a ship. Cargo could also change hands. Merchants could purchase goods that had already moved some distance by land or sea. So the ship's exact starting point remains unknown. Its destination is equally uncertain. It may have been carrying wine toward another Sicilian port, toward the Italian mainland, or farther across the western Mediterranean. Several routes were possible, and the ship's position near western Sicily places it within an active maritime zone. What we can say with greater confidence is that the vessel was traveling through a part of the Mediterranean where commercial traffic was common. Then something happened. The ship sank, but the wreck does not provide a simple explanation. There is no surviving ancient account describing its final hours. No written message tells us what the captain saw. No inscription records the weather that day. Several possibilities can therefore be considered. A sudden storm could have overwhelmed the vessel or made navigation impossible. Poor visibility or a navigational error could have brought the ship dangerously close to land. Rocks or submerged hazards could have damaged the hull. The cargo itself was heavy, and excessive loading could affect a ship's stability, although there is no evidence that this particular vessel was necessarily overloaded. These are possibilities, not established facts. It is important not to turn a reasonable hypothesis into a historical certainty. The Mediterranean can be dangerous even today, and ancient sailors had far fewer tools for predicting sudden changes in weather. But we cannot reconstruct the exact conditions surrounding this wreck simply by knowing that storms were possible. Nor can we say that the ship struck rocks merely because rocks existed nearby. The seabed preserves the result of the disaster better than the disaster itself. What happened in the final minutes has largely disappeared. Perhaps the crew saw bad weather approaching. Perhaps they attempted to alter course. Perhaps the ship suffered damage before reaching the coast. Perhaps the vessel encountered a hazard that the crew could not see in time. Or perhaps several problems occurred together. A damaged ship in rough weather could become vulnerable very quickly. The cargo might shift. Water could enter the hull. The crew could struggle to control the sails. A navigational mistake could become impossible to correct. But these remain reconstructions. The strongest evidence comes from what physically survived. The location of the wreck. The condition of the hull remains. The distribution of the amphorae. The objects found around the vessel. And the geological environment of the seabed. Archaeologists can study these clues and compare them with other ancient shipwrecks. They can ask whether the cargo appears to have shifted suddenly. They can examine damage to the surviving structure. They can investigate whether the vessel came to rest in a particular orientation. Each detail can narrow the possibilities, but some questions may never have a definite answer. We do not know the exact port from which the ship departed. We do not know its intended destination. We do not know the precise route it followed, and we do not know exactly what caused it to sink. What we do know is that a working merchant vessel entered the Mediterranean carrying a substantial cargo, and somewhere near the coast of Sicily, its voyage ended permanently. The uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the archaeological record. A shipwreck is not a complete historical document. It is a collection of surviving evidence. Sometimes that evidence is remarkably detailed. Sometimes the most important moment, the moment of sinking, is precisely the moment for which we have the fewest direct clues, and so the final voyage remains partly hidden. We can follow the ship as far as the evidence allows. We can identify the world in which it sailed. We can understand its cargo and its commercial purpose. We can map the possible routes, but at the final point, the trail disappears beneath the sea. Somewhere in those last hours, the merchant voyage became a wreck, and for more than 2,000 years, the Mediterranean kept the rest of the story to itself. Night settles over the Mediterranean, and somewhere in the darkness, a merchant ship continues its journey. We do not know exactly what happened aboard this vessel on the night it disappeared. No ancient account survives to describe its final hours, and the wreck cannot tell us precisely how the disaster began. But we can imagine one possible sequence, based only on what could realistically have happened to a merchant ship of this period. The crew would have been working in darkness, using the wind and the sea as their guides. The cargo would have remained below, hundreds of ceramic vessels packed tightly within the hull. Then the conditions may have changed. Perhaps the wind strengthened. Perhaps waves began striking the vessel harder. Perhaps visibility became poor. Or perhaps the ship encountered a navigational problem near the coast. At first, the crew might not have considered the situation disastrous. Ancient sailors were accustomed to difficult conditions. They would have adjusted the sails, changed course if necessary, and tried to keep the vessel under control. But a merchant ship carrying a heavy cargo had limits. If water began entering the hull, even slowly, the situation could change quickly. The crew would have needed to find the source of the problem and remove as much water as possible. At the same time, they would have had to protect the cargo and keep the vessel stable. If the ship began to roll heavily, the amphory could shift. A vessel tipping against another could break. One broken amphora could cause others to move. The carefully arranged cargo might gradually become unstable. Again, we do not know that this happened aboard the wreck. The amphory could have been displaced by the sinking itself, by the impact with the seabed, or by centuries of underwater movement. But if the vessel was already taking on water, a shifting cargo would have made the crew's task even more difficult. The people aboard would have had only limited options. They could reduce sail. They could change course. They could attempt repairs. They could move cargo if necessary. And they could try to keep the ship afloat for as long as possible. Perhaps they saw land. Perhaps they tried to reach shelter. Perhaps the weather prevented them from doing so. We simply do not know. What we can say is that the final stage of a sinking vessel would have been chaotic. The ship that had been a carefully organized working environment would suddenly become unstable. Wood would strain against the movement of the sea. Ropes could tighten. Sails could become difficult to control. Water would spread through the lower parts of the hull. The crew would have been surrounded by darkness, noise, and uncertainty. And eventually, if the water could not be contained, the vessel would have begun to lose its ability to remain afloat. The amphory, once carefully carried toward a distant market, would have become part of the sinking ship. The deck would have tilted. Objects would have shifted. The hull would have descended lower into the water. The sea would have risen around the vessel until the distinction between ship and ocean began to disappear. Then the Mediterranean would have closed over it. The ship descended toward the seabed. Its wooden structure settled into darkness. The cargo came to rest around it. The people who had been aboard were gone. Above them, the surface of the sea continued to move. Within a relatively short time, there might have been almost no visible sign that a ship had ever been there. No lighthouse marked the location. No modern signal remained. No message was sent back to the harbor. The voyage simply ended. For the crew, whatever the exact cause, the final moments must have been frightening. But we should not create details that archaeology cannot support. We do not know their final words. We do not know whether they escaped. We do not know whether they reached the surface. We do not know how quickly the ship sank. Those details belong to the unknown. What remains is the evidence of the aftermath. A merchant ship on the seabed, its cargo scattered and preserved. Fragments of its structure lying beneath the Mediterranean. A voyage interrupted more than 2,000 years ago, and above it, the same sea that had carried the ship toward its destination. The night passed. The waves continued. The wind changed. And eventually, the world above forgot that anything had happened there at all. Only the wreck remained below, waiting in the darkness for someone to find it again. After the ship disappeared beneath the Mediterranean, its story entered a very different kind of time. There were no witnesses left to record what happened. The sea simply continued above it. The wreck settled onto the seabed, and over the years and centuries, sediment slowly accumulated around the remains. Sand, silt, and other material carried by currents could cover parts of the vessel, protecting some objects while leaving others exposed. The wooden hull was far less fortunate. Underwater wood can survive for surprisingly long periods, but it is vulnerable to bacteria, fungi, and marine organisms. Shipworms and other organisms can gradually consume or weaken submerged timber, while constant exposure to seawater contributes to its deterioration. Over many centuries, much of the ship's wooden structure could disappear. The amphorae were different. Fired clay is far more resistant to the processes that destroy organic material. An amphora could break, become buried, and remain recognizable long after the wood around it had vanished. So the seabed slowly separated the ship into two histories. The living material disappeared. The ceramic material endured, and the sediment helped preserve both the surviving fragments and the position of the wreck. Around the remains, the sea continued its ordinary life. Small marine organisms settled on exposed surfaces. Sediment shifted with currents. Shells and other remains accumulated. The wreck became part of the underwater environment. It was no longer a ship in any practical sense. It was becoming a feature of the seabed. And while this happened below the surface, the world above was changing at an extraordinary speed. The Roman Republic continued its transformation. Rome expanded across the Mediterranean. Political power changed. The Republic eventually gave way to the Roman Empire. Emperors came and went. Cities grew and declined. Trade routes changed. New religions spread. Different peoples and armies crossed the same lands. Centuries passed. The Roman Empire itself transformed and eventually disappeared from the Western Mediterranean. New kingdoms emerged. New powers controlled old territories. Languages changed, ports changed, coastlines changed through both human activity and natural processes. And yet, beneath the water near Sicily, the wreck remained. A ship that had once belonged to a living commercial world had become almost completely detached from human history. Generation after generation passed above it. Fishermen traveled through the surrounding waters. Other ships crossed the Mediterranean. Perhaps vessels passed over the wreck without ever knowing what lay below. The surface offered no obvious clue. 46 meters beneath it, the ancient cargo remained. The sea did not care that Rome had risen. It did not care that Rome had become an empire. It did not care when emperors ruled, when empires weakened, or when new political worlds appeared along the shores. The wreck simply remained where it had settled. This is one of the quietest aspects of archaeology. History above the water can move rapidly. The seabed changes slowly. A political map can be transformed within a generation. A shipwreck can remain almost unchanged for centuries. Sediment may cover it a little more. Currents may expose one object and bury another. Marine life may grow over its surfaces, but the basic outline can remain. The Mediterranean becomes, in this sense, a remarkable archive. Not an archive of paper and ink, but one made of mud, sand, clay, wood, and stone. Its pages are scattered across the seabed. Some are erased, some are damaged. Some remain almost perfectly recognizable. The lost Roman ship belongs to this underwater archive. For more than 2,000 years, no historian stood beside it. No archaeologist measured its hull. No museum displayed its amphory. No visitor knew its location. The wreck existed without an audience. The sea preserved it without intention. And time continued to pass. One century became another. The Roman world changed beyond recognition. Yet the amphory remained among the sediment, holding the memory of a commercial voyage. The wood gradually returned to the sea. The cargo remained. And somewhere above, the Mediterranean continued to carry ships toward distant shores. The wreck had become silent, but it had not disappeared. It was simply waiting for the moment when the silence would finally be broken. When archaeologists look at an amphora, they are not simply looking at an old container. They are looking at a collection of clues. The shape can be important. Different amphora forms developed at different times and in different regions, allowing archaeologists to compare a vessel with securely dated examples from other sites. The clay can reveal something else. Pottery was made from local materials, and clay from different geological regions can contain different minerals and chemical characteristics. By examining the ceramic fabric, and in some cases carrying out laboratory analysis, researchers can compare an amphora with known production areas. This can help identify where a vessel was made. And that matters because the place where an amphora was produced may be far from the place where it was discovered. A container found near Sicily might have been manufactured somewhere else entirely. The amphora therefore becomes a record of movement. Researchers can also look for traces of what the vessel once contained. Organic material rarely survives unchanged for 2,000 years, but chemical residues can sometimes remain within the ceramic or surrounding sediment. Scientific analysis may provide evidence for wine, oil, or other products. No single clue is always enough. Archaeologists combine shape, clay, manufacturing technique, markings, residue, and archaeological context. The result can be surprisingly precise. If similar amphorae are repeatedly found in different regions, researchers can begin to reconstruct patterns of trade. A production center may appear to have supplied distant ports. A particular wine container may become common in one market, but rare in another. Over time, these distributions create a map of ancient commerce. The wreck near Mazzara del Vallo is especially useful because the amphorae were transporting together. Instead of studying isolated vessels from different sites, archaeologists can examine a cargo assembled for one voyage. If different amphora types or production fabrics occur within the same ship, that does not necessarily mean the cargo came from one place. It may indicate that merchants had gathered goods from several production areas before the voyage. A single ship could therefore bring together products that had traveled through different parts of the Mediterranean. This is one of the clearest ways a shipwreck can reveal how connected the ancient world had become. The people who loaded the ship did not need every product to come from the same village, island, or region. Goods could move toward a harbor from several directions. Merchants could combine them into a commercial cargo. The ship could then carry that cargo toward another market. What appears on the seabed as a collection of pottery can therefore represent an entire chain of movement. Clay came from one landscape. Potters worked it in a workshop. Wine or another product filled the vessel. Merchants acquired it. Workers transporting it to a harbor. Sailors carried it across the sea. And eventually the amphora ended its journey beneath Sicily. Archaeologists can reverse that journey. They start with the object. Then they ask where it was made. What did it contain? Who might have produced it? Where are similar examples found? What routes could have connected those places? Each answer adds another piece to the map. Over many excavations, these pieces begin to form networks. The pottery found in ports and settlements can be compared with pottery from shipwrecks. Production centers can be identified. Distribution patterns can be traced. Changes through time can be observed. And suddenly, the ancient Mediterranean becomes visible not as isolated communities, but as a system of exchange. The lost ship is only one point in that system, but it preserves the point unusually well. Its cargo was assembled before the voyage ended. The amphorae were still together when the ship sank. Their shapes, fabrics, and surviving traces provide evidence that can be studied more than 2,000 years later. The pottery cannot tell us the names of every merchant. It cannot reveal the exact route with complete certainty, but it can show that people, products, and production traditions were moving across considerable distances. That is perhaps the greatest secret hidden inside the pottery. An amphora looks small compared with the vast Roman world, but follow its clay back to its source, follow its contents to the place where they were produced, and follow the ship carrying it toward another market. The object becomes a route, and hundreds of objects together become a network. The silent cargo beneath the Mediterranean was therefore preserving something much larger than the history of one ship. It was preserving evidence of how deeply connected the Roman world had already become. Working on the wreck meant entering a world very different from an ordinary archaeological excavation. The site lies around 46 meters below the surface, deep enough that every minute underwater matters. At that depth, water pressure is several times greater than at the surface. Divers cannot simply remain underwater indefinitely. Their time must be carefully planned, and their ascent has to be controlled because of the effects of compressed gases on the body. The conditions can also make the archaeology difficult. Visibility may be limited. Fine sediment can be disturbed by a diver's movement, turning clear water into a cloud that hides the wreck only moments later. A diver may be looking directly at an archaeological object and still have difficulty understanding its position within the larger site. That is why documentation is essential. Before objects are moved, archaeologists need to understand where they are. The wreck must be mapped. Measurements are taken. The position of amphorae and structural remains is recorded. Photographs and underwater video provide another layer of evidence, allowing researchers to study details after the dive has ended. Every object has a context. An amphora lying inside the hull tells a different story from an amphora found several meters away. A wooden fragment beside a particular group of vessels may help explain how the cargo was arranged. A scattered concentration may reveal movement caused by the sinking or later disturbance. Once an object is removed, some of that information can be lost. This is one reason archaeologists do not simply collect everything they find. An underwater archaeological site is not a treasure chest. It is evidence. Removing an amphora without recording its exact position may preserve the object while destroying part of the information surrounding it. Modern underwater archaeology, therefore, places enormous importance on recording the site before excavation. Researchers can create detailed plans and photographic records, sometimes combining many images to produce a broader representation of the wreck. The goal is to understand the whole site, not simply to collect its most impressive objects. There is also the question of preservation. An artifact that has spent centuries underwater can become extremely vulnerable once it reaches the surface. Wood is a particularly good example. Waterlogged, ancient timber may appear solid while underwater, but after exposure to air it can deteriorate rapidly if it is not treated properly. Ceramics are more stable, but they can still require careful conservation and documentation. This creates another reason for leaving material in place when there is no clear archaeological need to remove it. The seabed can sometimes provide better protection than a museum storeroom that is not prepared to conserve the object. For this reason, archaeologists may document portions of a wreck without immediately excavating everything. The site remains where it has been for centuries, while researchers continue to learn from it through mapping, photography, analysis, and carefully planned excavation. At 46 meters, every task becomes slower and more demanding. A simple measurement that would take moments on land requires preparation underwater. A photograph may need to be taken again because of poor visibility. An object may have to be approached carefully so that sediment is not disturbed. The divers must constantly remain aware of their own safety as well as the archaeology around them. It is a very different kind of excavation. There are no comfortable working hours at the bottom. There is only the limited period available during each dive. Then the archaeologists must return to the surface, process their observations, examine the images, compare measurements, and prepare for the next descent. Slowly, the wreck becomes clearer, not because it is removed from the sea all at once, but because each dive adds another piece to the record. The ultimate purpose is not to bring the entire ancient ship into the modern world. It is to understand it, to know where the cargo was placed, to reconstruct how the vessel was built, to identify what survived, and to preserve the archaeological site for future researchers. After more than 2,000 years beneath the Mediterranean, The wreck has already survived an extraordinary length of time. The responsibility of modern archaeology is to make sure that its discovery does not become the beginning of its destruction. For all that the wreck has revealed, some of its most important questions remain unanswered. We know that the vessel belonged to the maritime world of the late Roman Republic, and its cargo provides valuable clues about its commercial purpose. But the exact beginning of its final voyage remains uncertain. We do not know the precise harbor from which it departed, nor do we know its final destination. The cargo can suggest possible connections between production centers and markets, but amphorae could change hands before they were loaded. A vessel's cargo does not automatically reveal the complete route taken by the ship. The people aboard are equally difficult to identify. The wreck has preserved evidence of their workplace, but not their names. We do not have a complete list of the captain, sailors, merchants, or other people who may have traveled on the vessel. They left behind no personal account of the voyage. Perhaps the greatest unanswered question is why the ship sank. A storm is possible. Navigation problems are possible. Damage to the hull is possible. Other explanations can also be considered. But without direct evidence, none should be presented as certain. The seabed preserves the final result, not necessarily the sequence of events that produced it. Even the ship itself has secrets. How much of the original wooden hull may still survive beneath the sediment? What has disappeared completely? What fragments remain hidden where archaeologists have not yet examined them? Ancient timber can survive under favorable underwater conditions, but it can also deteriorate dramatically over long periods. The visible wreck, therefore, may not represent everything that remains. The amphorae raise another set of questions. Their forms can tell researchers much about chronology and trade, but the exact contents of every vessel are not necessarily known. Some may preserve residues. Others may provide only indirect clues through their type, fabric, and archaeological context, and the cargo may have contained more than the amphorae that first attract attention. Other objects could have been used by the crew. Equipment could have belonged to the ship itself. Additional cargo may have been scattered, buried, or lost over the centuries. There may even be parts of the wreck that have not yet been fully recognized. That is one of the unsettling possibilities of underwater archaeology. The visible remains are not necessarily the entire site. Sediment can hide objects. Poor visibility can conceal details. Parts of the hull may lie beneath the seabed. Small artifacts can be overlooked. A material that has deteriorated beyond recognition may leave only traces rather than recognizable objects. Future research can therefore change the picture. New mapping techniques can reveal relationships between objects. Laboratory analysis can provide information about ceramics and residues. Comparisons with other Mediterranean wrecks can improve estimates of the ship's age and origin. Studies of amphora production can help researchers understand where the cargo came from and where it may have been intended to go. Each new piece of evidence can narrow the range of possibilities, but archaeology rarely produces every answer. Sometimes the most responsible conclusion is simply that something remains unknown. That uncertainty is especially important with this wreck. It would be easy to invent a complete story, a named captain, a known harbor, a precise destination, a sudden storm, and a dramatic final struggle. But the evidence does not give us those details. The real story is quieter. A ship existed. It carried a substantial commercial cargo. It traveled through the Mediterranean. It sank. And more than 2,000 years later, researchers are still trying to understand where it came from, where it was going, and what happened during its final voyage. The questions have changed since the wreck was discovered. At first, the question was simply, what is this? Then came the study of the ship, the amphory, the cargo, and the surrounding seabed. Now the questions are more precise. Where was the vessel built? Where did its cargo originate? Where was it intended to go? What exactly survived? And what might still be hidden beneath the sediment? The wreck has already given us remarkable answers, but perhaps its greatest mystery is that, after 2,000 years, it still has something left to say. The wreck near Mazzara del Vallo is not alone. Across the Mediterranean, the seabed holds the remains of countless vessels that once moved between its shores. Some carried wine, others transporting oil, grain, ceramics, metals, or less easily identified cargoes. Many of these ships disappeared without leaving a written record. That is what makes the Mediterranean so valuable to underwater archaeology. Its seabed acts almost like an archaeological archive. Ports changed. Cities disappeared. Empires rose and fell. But ships that sank could remain where they came to rest, sometimes beneath layers of sediment that protected their cargo and fragments of their hulls. A wreck can preserve a moment of movement that would otherwise have vanished completely. A group of amphorae may show where goods were produced. Their distribution can suggest commercial routes. The construction of a hull can reveal shipbuilding traditions. Even a small collection of objects can connect one coastline with another. Together, different wrecks begin to form a map beneath the sea. One ship may tell us about wine. Another may reveal the movement of olive oil. Another may preserve evidence of grain transport or military activity. No two wrecks are exactly alike. Some sank suddenly. Others may have broken apart gradually. Some were buried quickly. Others remained exposed for centuries. Their cargoes shifted, their wooden structures decayed, and marine life gradually became part of the remains. Every wreck, therefore, preserves a different combination of evidence, and every discovery can change what we know about ancient trade. A shipwreck may confirm a route that historians already suspected. It may reveal a connection between regions that was previously poorly understood, or it may provide evidence that forces researchers to reconsider an old assumption. The Mediterranean is particularly important because maritime trade was so deeply woven into the lives of the communities surrounding it. The same sea connected Italy, Sicily, North Africa, the Greek world, and the Western Mediterranean. Ships crossed it again and again. Most completed their voyages. Some did not. Those that sank became accidental time capsules, and new discoveries are still possible. Modern technology allows archaeologists to search areas that would have been extremely difficult to investigate in the past. Improved diving equipment, underwater mapping, remote sensing, photography, and digital recording can reveal structures that are almost invisible from the surface. A patch of pottery on the seabed may turn out to be the remains of a much larger site. A shape beneath sediment may belong to an ancient hull. A concentration of amphora fragments may mark a forgotten route. The sea is still capable of surprising researchers. For more than 2,000 years, the wreck near Sicily remained unknown to the modern world. Other wrecks are undoubtedly still waiting. They may lie beneath sand. They may be covered by sediment. They may be broken into fragments so subtle that they resemble the natural seabed. And somewhere beneath the Mediterranean, another ancient voyage may still be waiting to be reconstructed. The sea has preserved only what time allowed it to preserve. But even those fragments can speak. A single amphora can point toward a producer. A cargo can reveal a market. A hull can reveal a shipbuilding tradition. And a wreck can reveal a route. Together, they form a hidden history beneath the waves. The ancient Mediterranean was once crowded with ships. Today, many of those ships are gone from the surface, but some are still down there, silent, buried, and waiting to be found. After following the ship through its cargo, its crew, its voyage, and its long silence beneath the Mediterranean, we can finally separate what is known from what remains hidden. We know what the ship was carrying. Its most important surviving cargo was a large collection of amphorae, many identified as Dressel 1A vessels associated with wine transportation during the late Roman Republican period. We know that this was a merchant vessel, built for moving goods across the Mediterranean. We also know that people sailed aboard it. There would have been sailors responsible for handling the vessel, and there may have been merchants or others connected with the cargo. But their individual identities have been lost. The wreck has preserved their workplace, not their names. Then comes the question of where the ship was going. Here, certainty ends. The cargo can reveal connections with production and trade, but it cannot provide a complete route. The exact port of departure is unknown, and the intended destination is also uncertain. The same is true of the ship's final moments. We know that it sank near the Sicilian coast. We do not know exactly why. A storm, navigational problems, damage, or other circumstances are possible explanations, but the surviving evidence does not allow one of them to be stated as fact. That uncertainty is important. The wreck is not a story written from beginning to end. It is a collection of clues left behind after the story ended. And then came the longest part of the journey. 2,000 years of silence. The ship settled onto the seabed. Sediment accumulated around it. Much of the wooden structure gradually disappeared, while the ceramic cargo survived far better. Above the wreck, the Mediterranean continued to change. The Roman Republic became an empire. The Roman world transformed. Political powers rose and disappeared. Cities changed. Trade routes evolved. Centuries passed. But beneath the sea, the wreck remained. Eventually, modern divers found it. What had once been a commercial disaster became an archaeological discovery. And that discovery matters because the ship is much more than an isolated object. It gives us a glimpse into the economic world of ancient Rome. It shows how agricultural products could move between distant regions. It demonstrates the importance of maritime transport. It provides evidence about ancient pottery production, trade, shipbuilding, and the movement of goods across the Mediterranean. Most importantly, it reminds us that the Roman world was connected by countless ordinary voyages. This was not the ship of an emperor. It was not carrying a famous army. Its crew did not become historical figures. It was a working merchant vessel, and that is precisely why it is valuable. History is not made only by famous people and dramatic battles. It is also made by farmers producing wine, potters shaping clay, merchants organizing cargo, sailors crossing the sea, and workers loading ships at ancient harbors. This vessel brought all of those worlds together. Some questions have answers. Others remain below the surface. We know much about its cargo. We know something about its construction. We know the period in which it sailed. But its exact route, its destination, its crew, and the precise cause of its sinking remain uncertain. Perhaps future research will narrow those mysteries. Perhaps some will never be solved. For now, the ship rests where it has rested for more than 2,000 years. Its voyage ended long ago. But its evidence continues to travel, from the seabed into archaeological laboratories, museums, books, and our understanding of the ancient Mediterranean. The ship was lost. Its story was not. Night returns to Sicily. Along the coast, the lights of the modern world shimmer across the water. Roads, houses, and distant towns continue their quiet lives, while beyond them the Mediterranean stretches into darkness. Far below the surface, another world remains. The wreck lies on the seabed, surrounded by the same sea that covered it more than 2,000 years ago. There are no voices there now, only the slow movement of water across ancient remains. The amphorae are silent. Once they were filled with wine and carried as valuable cargo. They were handled by workers, loaded by sailors, and transporting toward a destination that we can no longer identify with certainty. Now they rest among sediment and fragments of the vessel that carried them. The wooden ship itself has largely disappeared. What remains are traces of the structure, pieces preserved by the underwater environment, and the shape of a vessel reconstructed from archaeological evidence. Yet even these fragments are enough to bring its world closer. We can imagine the sailors preparing the ship, the movement of cargo, the sound of ropes, the wind filling the sails, the long watches through the night, the simple meals and limited sleep. The uncertainty of traveling across a dark sea without the instruments we take for granted today. Their world was different from ours, but the purpose of the voyage is strangely familiar. People were producing something. Someone wanted to buy it. A merchant arranged its transport. Workers prepared the cargo. Sailors carried it across the sea. Thousands of years later, we still live in a world connected by the movement of goods. Ships continue to cross the Mediterranean. Cargo still moves between ports. Products are still produced in one place and consumed in another. The technology has changed almost beyond recognition, but the basic human system remains familiar. Someone makes, someone transports, someone trades, someone waits at the destination. That continuity is part of what makes the wreck so powerful. It is ancient, but it is not completely foreign. Beneath the water, the ship preserves a small part of ordinary human life, not the life of kings, not the history of a famous battle, just a working vessel carrying goods through the Mediterranean. And perhaps that is why its silence feels so long. For centuries, no one knew where the ship was. The Roman world disappeared. New empires crossed the Mediterranean. New cities rose along its shores. New ships followed old routes. Generations were born and died. And beneath all of them, the wreck remained. The sea became its shelter. Sediment covered it. Marine life surrounded it. Time passed over it. History continued above. The ship remained below. Sometimes history survives in books. Sometimes it survives in monuments. And sometimes it survives in places where nobody is looking. A broken piece of pottery, a fragment of timber, a shape beneath the seabed, a cargo resting in darkness. These objects can outlive the people who created them by thousands of years. The lost ship is one of those fragments. It cannot answer every question. It cannot tell us the names of its sailors or the exact moment when its voyage ended. but it can still speak through what remains, through its cargo, through its construction, through its position on the seabed, through the traces left behind by an ancient commercial world. And tonight, far below the quiet surface of the Mediterranean, the ship is still there, still silent, still surrounded by darkness, still holding the remains of a journey that began more than 2,000 years ago. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this ship is not that it sank 2,000 years ago, but that after all those centuries, the sea finally allowed us to hear its story. The sea has kept this ship for more than 2,000 years. We may never know exactly where its final voyage began, who stood on its deck, or what happened during the last moments before it disappeared beneath the Mediterranean. But what survived is enough. The amphorae have shown us a world of trade. The remains of the vessel have shown us the skill of ancient shipbuilders, and the darkness of the seabed has preserved a quiet connection between our world and theirs. A merchant ship once crossed these waters carrying ordinary goods for people who lived in a very different age. Today, those same waters still move beneath the night sky. The ancient voyage is over. The ship has finally been found, and its story can rest again. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey through history. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next journey through history. Good night.